The mountain Parnassian, of course, we've all seen these big white butterflies on our field trips. And one of the questions people often have is, so why is this not a white? I mean, it looks like a white. Why do we classify it instead with the swallowtails of all things? This doesn't look anything like a swallowtail. And the answer is kind of technical. It has to do with the venation, the veins and the wings. It has to do with a lot of the life cycle stuff, the way that there are some characters that this butterfly has that match it much better with the Parnassian, or with the swallowtails, than with the whites. And it's big, of course. It's much bigger than most of the butterflies, most of the whites, that is. One of the differences between this and the whites is the egg. The eggs of whites or parrots are spindle-shaped. They're kind of tapered on both ends and a little bit bigger in the middle. They're very slender and tapered, and they're attached at one point. And of course, you can see this egg is very, very different from that. This is a big egg, fairly round, but it's kind of a squished sphere, if you will, and of course has the very mottled surface there. This is the area where the egg is fertilized, and these eggs are laid on basically on inert substrate, on dead sticks or rocks in the vicinity of the host plants. The host plants are stone crops, and there's a variety of stone crops that these butterflies use. But the eggs overwinter, and they don't hatch, of course, until the next spring after the new stone crops have come up. So they're not laid right on the stone crops usually. Once in a while they are, but mostly they're on inert surfaces. Here's the first instar larva. They tend to coil up like this when you disturb them. That's one of their, actually clear up through all of the instars. This is one of their defensive moves, is when you touch them or disturb them, they'll coil up and fall off the plant. And they kind of fall into the detritus or into the plants. And that's their escape mechanism for predators. The second instar, in this instar, there are more sepia, or these light little spines, much more of them, and they're proportionally much shorter. And interestingly, you can see a row of yellow spots showing up on the side. That'll become more important as the larva grows. Here it is at 8 millimeters. It's just an early third instar, and you can see the spots are becoming much more distinct now. You notice this big funny thing here behind the head. That's a gland, and that's a gland that produces substances. We don't really know for sure what these substances are at this point, but they apparently are chemicals that are used for defense, much like the osmeterium in the behind the head of the swallowtails. They have a similar organ, but on the swallowtails, it's kind of a forked, bright orange thing that sticks up and emits chemicals that deter predators. And these have the same kind of gland there behind the head on the dorsal side. So that's another thing that links them to swallowtails instead of parrots.
Can you smell it?
They say that you can. I haven't tried, but yes, I think you probably can smell it. Here's the fourth instar. This is the next to the last stage, and you can see it's developing these very brightly contrasting spots. These are said to be warning coloration spots, and so it's believed that these larvae are toxic, or at least bad tasting, and it's another way that the larvae can deter predators is by having these very contrasting colors, warning colors that kind of shout to a predator, "Don't eat me." And here's the fully grown larva, 38 millimeters. Actually, this is a final instar, but this is actually not fully grown. They get quite a bit bigger than this, probably pretty close to 50 millimeters, about 2 inches long. They get quite big. And on some of our field trips, we found these larvae, especially in the last 2 instars, places like Chumstick Mountain, where they're wandering around feeding on the stone crops. The pupa is a very interesting shape. It's actually shaped somewhat like some of the swallowtail pupae, but very, very different than a pupa of again, the parrots, the whites. A pupa of a white would be very spindle-shaped, very long and pointed on both ends, and slender. So you can see this is a very different shape. So that's another thing that links these butterflies with the swallowtails rather than the peerage. Here's a typical habitat shot. This is up on the top of Quartz Mountain. How many were on the Quartz Mountain trip this year? Yeah, there's one. Yay! We had a nice trip up there and saw a lot of butterflies. In fact, we were right at this very spot, right at the crest of Quartz Mountain in Kittitas County. And a couple of years ago, when I took this photo, there were mountain fritillaries flying all over the slope. If you looked out across and just counted what you could see in your field of view, you might see 20 mountain Parnassians flying at any one time.
You said mountain fritillaries a moment ago. Was that just a slip of the tongue?
I'm sorry?
You said mountain fritillaries a moment ago.
Sorry.
It was a slip of the tongue, correct?
Let's call it mountain Parnassian.
Okay, good.
Not mountain fritillaries. You could see that most of the butterflies that were cruising around were males, and that's pretty typical of Parnassians. Quite a few other butterflies for that matter. The males cruise constantly looking for females, and the females only can mate one time. And so they, once mated, their interest is twofold. They want nectar, and they want a place to lay their eggs, and they don't want to be hassled by males. So they stay down in the scrub. They tend to not fly nearly as much, and you'll see them just kind of gently hopping along from spot to spot, and they go along with their feelers, trying to smell the substrates, finding a place to lay their egg. And then you see them laying their eggs on these little sticks, especially very small little sticks that are an inch or so above the ground, maybe a millimeter in diameter.
Where do the pupae? You said you had that one on a leaf. Is that normally where?
The pupae?
No, not the eggs, but
the pupae are undercover. I've never found a wild pupa. Yeah, they'll go down under rocks and under duff, but they definitely keep out of sight for their pupation spot. Here's a couple very daintily mating. They sort of tumble in this big mass upside down and flop around, and it's not a real sophisticated looking process. They're tumbling through the heather in this particular spot here. One thing that happens during mating is, with both of our Parnassian species, the male secretes a waxy structure on the abdomen of the female. It's called a sparagus, and it's essentially a chastity belt. Once he's mated with her, he secretes this waxy structure that prevents any other male from mating with her. Make sure that he's the parent of all the offspring. And here's how you find the larvae. You see these nice stone crops growing on the hillside, and as you look along, you'll see a larva. Sometimes it'll be fully out and basking in the sun. Other times it'll just sort of peeking out of the hiding hole like this. Notice some of the tips of the stone crops here. See these little spots? That's feeding marks that are just sort of partly healed over. They love the tips of the little succulent segments of the stone crops. That's the part they always eat. So when you're looking for Parnassian larvae, just look for a cluster of stone crops that have all the little tips eaten off. Yes?
The little chastity belt, how does that work? Is it a visual thing that the male will see, oh, she's got a chastity belt, or is there an odor, or do they still come around and try to be friendly?
I didn't bring a picture of one. With this species, it's a kind of a brown, waxy structure that sticks down from the tip of the abdomen. On our other species, the Clodius Parnassian, it's a big white thing. It's 2 or 3 times as big, a great big old white thing that sticks down on the tip of the abdomen. So they're easy enough to see. You can quickly tell at a glance if a female has mated or not. If it's mated, it'll have this little waxy structure. Kind of from side view, it'll look like kind of a little triangle, a brown triangle sticking down. And if you're looking at the abdomen, it would be probably about half the width of the abdomen, about that size. Big enough to easily see. Here's another larva just out lounging in the sun. They like to bask, and you can see they're not particularly concerned about predators because they have these what are called aposematic markings, these very distinct yellow and black contrasting markings, which are signaling I'm poisonous or I taste bad, don't eat me.
And they're mimicking, I believe, the
Millipede.
the millipede.
There is a millipede that's found in these same areas, but who's mimicking who, I'm not sure.
Well, the millipede gives off cyanide.
Okay, okay.
So this is probably mimicking the millipede.
I've heard it reported that people have actually seen birds try to eat these and spit them out, though. So I think there's more than just mimicry.
Excuse me.
I've seen those millipedes around where I live, where there's also a lot of green yard, and I was so excited. I said, oh my gosh, I found one. When I realized it was actually a millipede, because I know that the other Parnassian larvae looks a lot like this. I mean, really.
There's also a large moth larva that I've seen up on Chumstick Mountain that's very similar to this. Probably another part of a mimicry ring. Now, who's toxic and who isn't, I can't really say, but yes.
I was wondering if they're that obvious, how common is it for them to be parasitized?
Good question, and I really don't know. I have, of the ones that I've reared, I've never seen parasitism in this species, but it could be a problem, I don't know. Oh, I do have a picture of a female with the spikes. There it is. That little brown thing down there. So that's a female, and it's nectaring on northern buckwheat. This is a Reeser Creek over in Pinellas County. On the forewings, there's spots that vary from orange like this to almost red, and that's one way that you tell this species apart from the Proteus parnassian. The Proteus parnassian's male and female, neither of them have any orange or red spots on the forewing. Their orange and red spots are confined to the hind wing. Also, you notice the antennae. I think you've all seen this field mark in the field. The Proteus parnassian will have solid black antennae, while this species, the Smithius parnassian, the mountain parnassian, has the black and white bands on the antennae. Here's a dorsal view, also a female. And again, you're seeing the forewing here, and you're seeing the big orange spots there on the forewing. If this were Proteus, it would not have those spots at all, male or female. Now, in the male of this species, not Parnassian, in the male, these spots can be very subtle. They can be down to a very small little yellow spot, and they're kind of easy to miss, but they're always there. And so that's as good a field mark as the checkered antennae.
Is that how you're telling this is a female because it has bold red spots on the forewing?
I think it's the same individual. And since it has asparagus, it's a female.
That's how you told.
That's one way. The other, oops, what did I do? Yeah, from the side view, another good indicator is this big black blotch here. In Smithius or Mountain Parnassian, the females have this big extended black area. There's some black there on the male, but it's much smaller, much more reduced than this. So that's another mark that tells us this is a female. And I think that's the end of it. Yes, Richard.
How do they overwinter?
They overwinter as eggs. The eggs are actually fairly easy to come by. If you catch a gravid female, they'll oviposit fairly readily, especially if you put her in with some remnants of the host plant, the stone crops. They don't have to be fresh, but just something there to give them the smell, and you get eggs. They're very difficult to rear. Once you get the eggs, they're easy to get, they're easy to overwinter, and when you take them out of the refrigerator the next spring, they will hatch very, very quickly, sometimes within half hour or an hour. Just boom, they hatch. But then it's very difficult to get them to feed, and that's where you lose all your larvae, trying to get them to feed on the stone crops. Bob?
Well, when you first mentioned the comparison to the swallowtails, some European species, especially like in Russia and Northern Europe, are well-tailed. They have really nice ornate tails on them.
Okay.
And so they actually look like a swallowtail. They look like actually a Parnassian swallowtail.
Really?
And so that shows kind of a genetic connection there.
Yeah, it does. David?
Can you comment a little bit on the mating behavior?
Because you said when they tumble out, and it's my understanding that the Parnassians are one of the few butterflies that resort to rape.
Yeah, I guess you could call it that, if you want to answer for more advice. It's a rough and tumble thing. That's one of the reasons the females stay pretty close to the host plants, and they stay where there's nectar or a place they can lay eggs. They're not flying around much. Once they take flight, the males just nail them, and they go tumbling to the ground. And you can see when they're in that heather there, they're just sort of a tumbling mass of two butterflies. So it's pretty rough duty. Yeah. I don't know if I would use the word rape. That's pretty anthropomorphic.
Do you know if there are preferred stone crop species, sedum species that they use versus others?
There's something like 6 species that are listed as host plants in our region. Lanceolatum is the one that they seem to use most in our area, probably because it's one of the more common stone crops. I think the rosacea, what's the common name for that one? The rosy stone crop or something, is used, and yeah, they don't seem to be that selective. The interesting thing about stone crops is some authors have written that stone crops, when they first come up in the spring, they're quite toxic for the first couple of weeks, and it's not until the stone crops kind of mature that they lose that toxicity. And so the larvae, if they feed on the stone crops when they first come up, they might have, it might kill them. I don't know.
Dave, do you ever see, when you're looking at signs of bleeding on the sedums, is it just as you showed us? I mean, that was very subtle, just, like maybe a few little nibbles on a tip that had some damage, but that was the extent of what you could see. Is that typical?
It's fairly typical. I think the damage I've seen is a little more than that, but it's just the tip. They just feed on the tips, and they'll go through. There's a lot of stone crops up there, and a larva you see them walking around. They walk around between plants, and they just nibble. They just take all the tips off and go to another plant.
Maybe they're less toxic.
Maybe. I don't know why they do that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more tasty. I don't know.
So, did you say there are a lot of species of stone crop, or are there just a lot of species they prefer?
There are not a lot of species. What would you say? Maybe 10?
Something like that throughout the state, and different distributions. So, for example, there's the one we'd see most often along the Puget Sound coastline would be spathulatum, and it would be at a low altitude. And so I think these Smenthius parnassians are usually at a higher altitude.
Usually, but they come fairly low in places.
Okay, so one of the limiting factors of which ones they use will be where they are.
Yeah. And the Clodius parnassian and the Smenthius parnassian do have areas where they overlap. Not many, but there are places. The Clodius, of course, uses bleeding heart. It's a completely different host plant. But there are some areas where you find them together. So you do need to know how to identify them in those areas. Yes?
I don't know how much time we have for this discussion, but I've always been intrigued by their wings. And the wings seem like they're made out of a substance quite different from other butterfly wings. And I wonder if you could tell us anything. Is that true, or?
I think they're pretty much the same thing. What happens is you get these big black spots at the tips of the wings, especially in the females. Those are actually areas where there's no scales. So they're kind of translucent. I might have a picture where you can kind of...
But when I take all the scales off of butterfly wing, it seems to be...
They're not as dark. They're
well, they're so waxy.
Oh, okay.
In the substrate of the wing, it seems like they're just very. I just found them to be very unusual wings. And I've never seen anything on chemical composition or anything.
No, I haven't actually. They're big, strong butterflies. It might be that the membranes are maybe heavier, stronger to support them than certainly something like Lycaena, the little butterfly. But I hadn't heard that there was any real structural difference.
Okay, thank you, Dave.